Hey everyone, in this video we're going to be looking at Peopleware Chapter 10, which is called Brain Time versus Body Time, and focuses on the difference between your body merely being in the building and actually getting work done with your mind. In Chapter 9, we talked about architect Gerald McHugh and how he studied IBM employees prior to building their Santa Teresa laboratory. One of his observations was that people split their time between needing quiet to focus and being the source of noise, namely that they spend some percent of their time working alone and some percent of their day working with others. The latter is an important thing to consider since up to this point, noise has been seen as this one-dimensional, evil presence that preys on your people's ability to do good work. And while that's true for the people affected by it, the sources of the noise are people who are legitimately doing their own jobs, communicating with others around them. The authors observed in the previously mentioned Code War Games survey that on average, an engineer spends 30% of her time working alone, 50% working with one other person, and 20% working with two or more people. However, the 30% solitary time is the time that the code is actually produced, unless it's a pair programming team. And so accepting those cases, that 30% is when she needs to be in what we call a flow state. So flow, if you aren't already familiar with the term, is, as the authors define it, a condition of deep, nearly meditative involvement. This is where you're so focused and so in the zone that time can pass by without you even realizing it, because the work is so engaging and all of your energy is focused on it. So what you need to do comes more naturally to you. As you've probably experienced the flow state yourself, you'd know that it isn't something that can be turned on and off in a moment, but rather takes about 15 minutes or so of concentration to glide into. Once you're there, that state has to be maintained by a lack of distractions. And if you are distracted, your flow will be turned into choppy rapids, and you'll need to spend more time to get back to that smooth sailing. Now, thinking about the importance of flow and how long it takes to get there, consider the consequence of an interruption, regardless of how small. A coworker taps you on the shoulder to ask a question, you get a Slack notification and you check it. Whatever it may be, there are distractions that break you out of that psychological homeostasis that you're in. And this isn't to say that those distractions are de facto bad things. After all, questions do need to be asked and answered of each other. Communication is very important, and we're not each our own island. So I'm saying this with the full awareness that I myself have been a distraction to others, and others have been that to me. And that is, to a large extent, a sacrifice we make for the good of our teammates and the organization as a whole. But to the extent that you can minimize such distractions, it is worth thinking on and putting into practice in a way that makes sense for your context, for your team, for where you are as a company, for where you're located physically, what's around you, and so on. Now, it does so happen that in the modern open office workplace, distractions happen constantly, and as a result, there are actually very few unbroken hours of mental solitary work time. An unfortunate phenomenon that arises in management is that most of your work requires that you be the perpetrator of distraction to your people. It is worth noting that and organizing your day in such a way that you can minimize these disruptions so that your people can do work with fewer concentration breaks. Time accounting is done by counting the time that employees are at work, and flexible work environments are getting more common, but the precedent of the 40 or more hour work week refers to bodies in the building and faces getting fluorescent tans from their computer screens. Now, this kind of measurement does make sense for jobs that don't require a flow state, but for intellect-heavy jobs like engineering, hours in the building is not a predictor of productivity at all. A better indicator would be hours of uninterrupted work time. This is significant because while a person can control the time that he comes to work and the time that he leaves, the number of disruptions during the day is a result of the physical environment and the cultural inclination of his coworkers. So the authors introduce the concept of what they call a, quote, environmental factor, or E factor. This quasi-clever term encompasses the ratio of uninterrupted working hours to total body present hours during the day. The higher the better, and for benchmarks they suggest that a high score would be something like 0.4, meaning that 40% of the workday is uninterrupted working hours. Higher numbers imply a workspace conducive to productivity, while a lower score suggests a workspace not conducive to productivity and perhaps even frustration from your employees as a side effect. That ratio is worth noting for yourself personally and improving to the extent that you can. I can certainly attest anecdotally that my productivity has gone up in line with an increase in uninterrupted work hours. The authors talk about the craziness of being the first to measure uninterrupted work hours, but they say that they've seen that practice catch on, and that eventually once people are acclimated to the idea of measuring it, the authors observed that as one of their customer companies started measuring that and putting it into practice, people on the team would start putting red bandanas on their desks to signal that they should not be disturbed. And once enough people did that, it started to become a cultural norm, and people became more respectful of each other's time. The last part of the chapter is an anecdote from Mr. Demarco's time at Bell Labs, where his office mate, who, seemingly zoning out at his desk, was asked by his boss what he was doing. The office mate said he was thinking, and his boss unironically replied, "Can't you do that at home?" Hilarious and sad though that may be, it's important to recognize that people's brains are the most valuable part of an organization. Therefore, it's worth fostering and creating a space and culture conducive to its flourishing.